Hello, my name is George Brenneman, and welcome to the Restore Wellness Podcast.
My name is Keith Tenenfeld. Welcome, guys.
And our special guest today, Representative Warren Davidson. Warren, thank you so much for coming down to Southwest Ohio and spending some time with us.
It's an honor to join you guys. Always great to be home in Ohio.
Excellent.
Great.
I understand that you're a West Point grad, a Notre Dame grad, and an Army Ranger. Is that correct?
Yeah, I enlisted in the Army out of high school and got the chance to go to West Point. That's not the normal route, but, that was where my story ended. You said, God bless America, and got out of the Army, went to Notre Dame for business school, and was working in manufacturing before I, decided to run for Congress. While I was in the Army, got the chance to serve in Ranger Regiment. That's probably still the coolest job I've had.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And tell us, what was that moment you said, I'm going to go ahead and run for Congress? That's not everybody's, bucket list.
Well,
It's not a healthy choice either, right?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people say I must have hit my head, right? Something went wrong. Speaker Boehner was our representative in, the area where I lived. And, of course, we've been redistricted since. So Hamilton County was always separate. For a long time, Steve Shabbat was the rep in western Hamilton County. And for 25 years, Speaker Boehner represented, Butler County and parts north of there. And when he resigned as Speaker, immediately people that always thought they would run for office filed, state rep, state senator, county auditor, some business guys and some activists, grassroots people. And, in October of 2015, I started getting invites to various fundraisers. In November, Jim Jordan, who's a member of Congress from Ohio, well known for a lot of your audience probably, he stopped into my office, manufacturing company office, and was raising money. I said, sure, count me in, love to get you some reinforcements so we can finally win there. And he's like, well, hey, who are you going to back to replace Boehner? And I said, well, I don't know. You're Jim Jordan, not me. You tell me, I'll take a look at him. And he really kind of cracked a joke. He goes, well, it'd be great if there's an Army Ranger business guy in the race. We just laughed. And I said, yeah, tell me who to make the check out to. But I went home and talked to my wife, and I thought she would laugh. And she said, well, what'd you tell him? And I said, well, we laughed because we thought it was crazy. And she goes, it's not crazy. You'd be great at that. You should call him back. And so, ultimately, obviously, I did. We got in the race like 10 minutes before the filing deadline. And,
wow.
Here we are.
History.
Yeah, that's how I got into this.
Meant to be. That's excellent.
Yeah.
So we're here at My Fitness Suites in Coleraine Township, and I want to thank Tyler and his crew for letting us use your facility. This is an amazing place. Urge you to check it out. We'll put his link in the podcast notes. But we're here to talk about wellness and health. So we tend to avoid the political side of things, but they are interlinked. There's a lot of stuff going on in the health arena that's affected by government regulations or the government agencies, and I think COVID drove that home. I think the key takeaway from COVID is never trust your personal health to other people. And so post-COVID, I know you're strongly in the camp of we can't let some of the stuff like the mandates and the school closings and all that happen again. What do you think was the major political side effect of that, health and wellness disaster?
Well, you think about a pandemic, and a lot of people called COVID, pandemic risk. And pandemic risk is, there's a pandemic, there's a health issue out there, and you make different choices because there is. Like maybe I'll go to the basketball game and be in a crowd, or maybe I'll go out in public and be in a crowd or whatever. We didn't have just pandemic risk. We had political risk, where even if you wanted to go do certain things, you couldn't do it. And this was almost never with an election. The legislature in states, the city council in cities, they didn't get involved. It was all executive action by mayors and governors around the country that were imposing this on the country. And I will say, look, I wasn't out at the 50. I was down on day one of closed down because I didn't understand the logic, because we had briefings about COVID and who it affected and how it worked. And young, fit, healthy people were never at significant risk of COVID. So one of the first things they did was close the schools. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. It seems like if you've got elderly staff people, or you've got people that are immune system compromised because of a health condition, maybe they should not come. But like the idea that the kids themselves were at high risk seemed crazy to me from the information we knew early on.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, super, super low risk for young, fit, healthy people.
I've been in the medical industry as a critical care ICU nurse, ER nurse, seeing a lot of how the inside of the hospitals operate. And when COVID was coming our way, and now I was a nurse practitioner, I said, this isn't making sense. The science really isn't lining up here. We need to increase access instead of decrease access. And people were scared of hospitals because you heard the horror stories of people going in and dying because of remdesivir or being intubated. And they were being fed, basically misinformation of ways that they could get themselves better, high dose zinc, even the simple stuff. And so I feel like we have opened up a door for people to understand that their wellness should be their responsibility. We should be going out, educating each other, encouraging each other to heal each other through the simple tactics of diet, exercise, hydration, sleep, and all those fundamentals. And here we are now with MAHA. And how do we bring that message back home where we can begin to say, listen, the physicians have their place in our lives, but they can't or shouldn't dictate every single thing like they did during COVID.
Yeah, and I mean, look, one of the things that they kept saying during COVID was trust the science, which was one of the most unscientific things ever. I mean, science is iterative experiments, and you show your data and say why.
And you don't throw out data that disagrees with what you're trying to say, because that's usually where the answer is.
Yeah, if you have, this is one of the key things. I served with Governor DeSantis when he was in the House of Representatives, and I had gotten to know the person he picked to be his health director, who at the time his first health director was Mary Mayhew, and I wanted to talk to her. I said, what is it that you guys are seeing that gives you the confidence to really kind of buck the system and make your own decisions? She's like, well, we get the federal data, but because we have so many natural disasters in Florida, we have really good county level health data. So we're just looking at our own data and making decisions. And so very early on, they were saying, no, you don't release the senior citizens back to go to the nursing homes where this will spread. You hold them at the hospital. And Medicare didn't want to pay for those bills because they're so used to saying, get them out of the hospitals and back. But they said, we'll take care of it at the state level. Just keep them at the hospitals. So they weren't trusting the press release. They weren't trusting the political science. They were trusting the real science, the data that they were seeing on the ground.
And furthermore, they recently did a study with MIT. The state of Florida did a study with MIT, which showed significant adverse reactions of Pfizer's vaccine over Moderna, and we can get into the vaccine situation, but there were some significant health risks that, hey, wait a minute. So the Pfizer vaccine caused all increased mortality over Moderna. It increased cardiac disease over Moderna. It increased cancer over Moderna. But the fact that it caused all-cause mortality and all-cause, cardiac events and cancer should be raising everybody's suspicion. And so I really commend DeSantis really promoting that and researching. And Japanese study just recently came out with something very, very similar as well. I also like to find that what about when we're talking about the space of what decisions were being made with COVID? How do you feel that we could have done? What could we have done different during that time?
Well, I mean, I think it begins with the closures for one, but then if you're going to close the economy, the reality is you got to do something about the GDP. So I talked to a business owner back at that time where he was like, look, the government told me to close my business. They told guests to not come to my business, and for good measure, they put physical barriers at my business. He goes, this is a business in the United States of America. I'm supposed to reserve for that risk. I mean, I think the government has to pay me because they've taken my property. And that's how the logic came behind the first bill. And a lot of people went along with the very first COVID response. The concept of the payroll protection program, people still don't understand that. They say it was a gift to businesses. Well, unemployment, because you closed everything, all these people were laid off. So you had massive surge in unemployment around the country. But the logic was, well, we don't want people to be laid off. And for people with benefits, they're better off keeping their benefits. There's no way we can process this many people being unemployed. Let's just, if you keep your people at work, then we're going to basically pay payroll. Mm-hmm. But what that turned into was a compulsion. It was like, given one dose of heroin, they became junkies and they were hooked on it. Like all that they wanted for like 2 or 3 years was government spending. And frankly, there's still massive cravings for the massive government spending to the point, we're pre-COVID, we were spending under $5 trillion a year. Now we're spending $7.2 trillion a year. If all we did was go back to the pre-COVID levels of spending, our budget would be balanced. And it wasn't like we had no government back then. People were feeling like at the time we had too much government.
Right.
If we had that level of government, we would actually have a balanced budget right now.
That's a really good point. And here, might be a controversial question, and I apologize. But, early on, Anthony Fauci sent an email out to Peter Daszak and everybody else, those Eco Alliance and Health, and now he's off the map. And I believe that there's a whole mystery. There's a whole Epstein list behind Anthony Fauci, if you will. Where are we at with that? What as far as the Wuhan origins and such?
Well, Joe Biden or whoever was in control of the auto pen didn't accidentally pardon Fauci, and he didn't accidentally pardon Fauci all the way back to anything pre-2014. So if you go back, a lot of this does go to have a nexus in Ukraine with some of the research that was going on there, and it's gain of function, things that you're not supposed to do in the United States. Fauci funded it. And, I think most credible people believed early on, Tom Cotton on the Senate Intel Committee sounded the alarm, and the Fauci's messaging, the New York Times, everybody attacked Cotton for just pointing out the obvious conclusions that, hey, this wasn't some bat in a wet market. This was, an engineered virus. And so I think the question is anyone ever really going to be held accountable for that? And, we say, well, they're supposed to. Right? But so far not. And Congress couldn't even really have hearings on it until we got Republican majorities. Right. So then we started, in the absence of that, one of my colleagues, Marjorie Taylor Greene, really led a lot of these hearings. And, we had doctors that were being canceled and demonetized. Yep. One of them, Bhattacharya, who's now the director of NIH. Excellent. So if you look at the momentum behind the Make America Healthy Great Again coalition, I know when President Trump relaunched his presidential campaign in 2023, my question to them was, could we, they wanted me to endorse him, and I'm like, well, of course I think he's going to win, but what I would like to do is time my endorsement with some statement like, what happened under COVID is never going to happen again. Yeah. And, people took it the wrong way, like, oh, you're trying to leverage Trump. Like, well, I'm not trying to leverage Trump. He's going to win. I'm just saying I would like my endorsement to be timed with some statement like that. And his campaign managers didn't want to do anything about COVID for a long time. And John Rich, who's a musician, conservative activist guy, recently was telling a story about how back in the summer before the convention, the summer of 24, he's having dinner with President Trump and some others, and President Trump looked straight to John Rich and he said, I got booed on stage for talking about warp speed and COVID and what a great success it was. Why'd I get booed? Mm-hmm. And he's like, it felt like an eternity because my life's flashing before my eyes. He's like, I love President Trump, but I know he doesn't take everything well. And he's like, I can't shirk the question. I got to give an honest answer here. And he's like, well, Mr. President, people got hurt by that. That warp speed didn't work well. The shots caused problems. People really feel like you could have done a better job with COVID. And he's like, we had a long conversation, and I thought, this is probably going to be the last time I ever have dinner with Donald Trump. And President Trump took it differently, and I think some of those kinds of conversations, people weren't having that kind of candor with President Trump for a long time, even during the campaign. And you come out of the convention right at that time frame, and the coalition's made. RFK clearly wasn't going to win any state, but he could have peeled off an awful lot of votes in enough states, maybe enough to flip some states. But it wasn't just that coalition, it was the momentum that it built, where he's partnering with all these people that aren't traditionally, Republican. They became not inherently Republican, but inherently Make America Great Again. And you had this MAGA coalition. You had, in that same kind of time frame, Elon Musk and kind of Silicon Valley and this more libertarian bent coming in, and the origins of Doge. And the coalition just kept building. And so the momentum through the 2024 election was huge, but a big part of it was just candor about what was really going on with COVID.
A really interesting point that not a lot of people know. RFK spent a lot of time with Paul Merrick, Pierre Corey and Malone, who are all kind of this grassroots, how do we treat COVID from a holistic standpoint? And I think that had a large influence on RFK's movement to really push the American, health agenda. And so I just want to commend all the doctors or the frontline doctors who stood against the science and decided to really put their lives and license on the line. And that was a really helpful thing.
And
that
give
we are
true
here today.
solutions to the problem.
Right, exactly.
So post-COVID now, post all of this, we have an opportunity now to leverage that feeling about Maha, that feeling that, hey, there is some opportunity here in the health area. And I like to call it wellness as opposed to health, because you hear the term health care all the time. It's really sick care. They're just treating symptoms. So the main reason behind this origin story of Restore Wellness was the idea we want to get information out there on how you can take control of your health and wellness. And I feel like right now it's ripe to make some major changes at the federal level. So we are already seeing things like reevaluating the pyramid, which is upside down. Things like evaluating whether or not we should put petroleum dyes in food for kids. Stuff that is
Fluoride in
ludicrous
water.
once you see it. Fluoride in water. All of these things are now being looked at. How do we leverage this moment in time for change to actually do something fundamental to reduce chronic illness, to get rid of the problem we have with obesity in the country? What do you see are the major opportunities? What's government's role moving in this new direction?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And look, I think personnel is policy. That's why it was so huge to get RFK, not just as an advisor, but as a secretary. And, a lot of the Senate wanted to balk at that. And so really the grassroots around the country put pressure on the Senate to make sure that RFK didn't just get nominated, he got confirmed. So I'd say to the country, keep doing what you've been doing and don't get distracted. They are pushing changes in our food pyramid and in our diet. And yes, at an individual level, you as an individual, no matter how bad the circumstances are responsible for, diet, exercise, sleep, hydration, those things you can control. But it's awful hard to do that in our society. And I just spent, in May, end of May, I spent a week in Europe. And I feasted. I felt like, gosh, I must have gained weight, right? I come back to the United States, I'm down 4 pounds.
Wow.
And it's because they put different stuff in their food. It wasn't like I did a different routine. I like my job in a ways. I attend meetings. Basically,
Rubber chicken dinners.
I go to a lot. They always serve food and drink, and I go to meetings. That's largely what I've done as an elected official for a time now. And you have meetings about the meetings, and then you debate things. But in between, you always seem to have food. Well, I did a lot of that when I was in Europe, and I lost 4 pounds. So the content
Something's
of the
different.
food really
I hear
is
that
different.
all the time. I hear that all the time from my patients. They go across, they come back, they feel great. I'm allergic to gluten unless I go to Europe. And I think that just says something about our farming and our agriculture industry. And there's this big conspiracy that Bill Gates is buying all the farmland and stuff. And I think that we really need to get local farmers involved for our local communities. What's going on in the White House with that?
Well, one of the big things that we're talking about, aside from some of the things that George just mentioned, are like Thomas Massey in Kentucky, just across the river from us. He's got a bill called the Prime Act, and this basically lets intrastate, like right now, food labeling. We've got this stupid rule that you can't really know the country of origin of your meat, and that seems crazy. But if you had it without being regulated by the USDA, not selling across state lines, you could process meat differently. And part of the issue is economics. So much consolidations happen. You really have 4 major meat processors, and 2 of them are foreign owned, one Chinese, one Brazilian.
How did we get to this? How did we get things added to our diet, the food colorings, the artificial flavors, the chemicals? What allowed that to get into our food in the first place?
Well, if you look like the incentive structure for, NIH and CDC and USDA, a lot of times the scientists that are supposedly reviewing and approving this, well, they get money off of what they approve. So kind of their funding mechanism becomes saying yes. And, when you can take shortcuts, it's apparently way more profitable. So a lot of the family-owned businesses in the food business are now, quote, the food business. They're bought by big private equity firms, big conglomerates, and they're squeezing every penny that they can out of it, and that's where you wind up with fake everything. And
well, I mean, I'm a provider, and if I prescribe a medication that causes harm to people, they're coming down on me. But then we got, autism rates are going up. We got ADHD. We got all these cancers and all these other things that are attributed to this. Where, I'm not trying to be conflictual, but there needs to be accountability on that side of things, it sounds like.
Oh, there clearly should be accountability, but if you look at RFK, it was controversial for him to simply say that we should study why is the rate of autism rising.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, isn't that like a rational thing? Like, this is happening.
Isn't that trust the science?
Wouldn't we want to know why? And so, they attacked him for even beginning to do the study because, you hate people with autism. Like, well, no. But given the choice, you would prefer that your child not have autism. Let's find out why the rates of autism are going up. And so he's commencing the study on it. We haven't even scientifically studied some of these things. And frankly, that's the scary thing. You link back to COVID. I mean, mRNA, I don't think the science looks very good on it. Dr. Malone's been one of the big critics of this. I mean, he came in and talked to us at a hearing. Based off of what I've talked to with him and Bhattacharya and some others, I'm like, I'm not sure why we're still available for sale, except with a conditional use. But it's still just now being turned off on the recommended vaccine list for kids. And clearly there are some concerns about mRNA. And the problem is, if you link that back to the food supply, they're pushing this to be injected into the food supply. And, you don't really have clear science on that yet either. So when we had the kind of bird flu issues here in Ohio and in Iowa, a lot of our chickens were getting bird flu. So the way that they were going about culling the chickens and
driving up egg prices.
Drove up egg prices. What did we end up doing? Another warp speed? That's what a lot of people wanted to do. But thankfully, calmer heads prevailed. And we let it work its way out, and that's part of what happened to kill the science in the COVID pandemic. Is the idea of natural immunity was somehow extinct, and magically it's been resurrected because we have different people.
Well, it's interesting as you're talking about that. The kids are over here playing with live chickens,
yeah,
and we get our eggs from right up the street here, as opposed to going to Kroger's or whatever. So, the Prime Act and what Massey's doing there. The whole idea behind raw milk and maybe getting food from your butcher directly as opposed to from USDA stuff. Do you see an opportunity here to reduce regulation in the food industry while at the same time improving quality?
Well, I think you can reduce regulation, and I think you can do more antitrust activity to encourage competition. And some of this even goes with our trade associations. I was talking to, some of the folks in the Cattlemen's Association, and you have the guys raising the beef in the same trade association as the processors.
Oh,
their interests aren't inherently aligned. And I mean, I experienced that as I owned manufacturing companies, and you had this top level National Association of Manufacturers, and all they were doing is pushing more offshoring to China, which was working pretty well for General Motors at the time, but everyone in the supply chain was getting wrecked.
Right.
And so the interests aren't inherently aligned. And so I do think the grassroots, needs to engage in the political process too, which is why I think the kind of thing that you guys are doing to engage the public is incredibly important because, my colleagues and we listen to the people and, a lot. If you don't listen to the people, the lobbyists come in. Well, the big corporations, part of the people are like, why does the status quo never change? Or if it does, it's so hard to change it. Well, the system is kind of rigged, right? And the people that are benefiting the most from the way it's rigged spend the most lobbying. So they're going to get in front of your member of Congress. They're going to get in front of your senator. They're going to get in front of, your state reps, state senators, and your regulators. So as regular people, you've got to keep raising these issues and demand a change because I think that's really a lot of what's going to happen is politics and economics. And you'll see, at a superficial level, you see the rise of organic and, every kind of food label says organic. But what they're doing is they're torturing the death out of that definition.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
So that they can put it on there, and it's become almost meaningless to have the word organic on it.
Not a lot of people are trusting that, yeah.
And so you're right to have skepticism on that. And it's when I first got elected, I was like, one of my Army sayings was, deeds, not words. It's really what you do, not so much what you say. You don't have to say a whole lot. You can be quiet and just get stuff done. But actually, Jim Jordan's the guy that told me, he said, well, in politics, it kind of is the words a lot, and it is the words and the deeds. And, he's got his other saying, you do what you said you would do. And he's just a super effective guy. But the words are kind of how they're corrupting a lot of things in society. You look at, the definitions for anything, whether what is a woman at a really basic level, they try to redefine everything in the world. So if you don't get control of the language, the words become kind of meaningless. And so you can say, oh, I'm going to the store and feeling good because I bought, organic this or non-GMO that.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means.
Yeah.
So as we come to the end, thank you again for coming here. I have a personal question. So Army Ranger is a fairly physically intense thing. Could you do it now?
Oh, no. I mean, look.
If not, why not?
I love the Toby Keith song, I'm as good once as I ever was, that song. But, I think the Mike Tyson fight kind of maybe convinced us all that, well, maybe not. I'm not as good once as I once was. I mean, when I was in high school, I wrestled middle school, high school. When I joined the infantry, I was pretty fit. And then I kept getting stronger and faster until I was about 27. I think I was 28, 29 when I left Ranger Regiment. And, I stayed pretty fit until I went back to business school. And that's when I for the first time in my life, I got out of shape because I was like, I got 2 little kids. I'm trying to grow a business, trying to finish a business degree. The only time I could find to get any of my business school work done was, I used to work out I used to work out every morning, for about an hour and a half. And a lot of times I do 2 a days even, this was even after I got out of the Army. And I took that time and devoted to school, and I got the business degree done, but I got out of the daily habit. And so since then I've kind of been a binge fitness guy. So I'll binge and get back in shape, and I'll lose 20 or 30 pounds, and people go, oh, are you sick? Do you have cancer or something? You don't look healthy. And I'm like, no, this is how I'm supposed to look.
Right.
But I'm on the other side now.
It's never too late to reinvent yourself. It's a great time to say, hey, let's start tomorrow. Let's reinvent ourselves, make us a new version of ourselves.
That's a good thought. Yeah. One of my friend's dads, when I was at West Point, had a heart attack. So he would have been in his 40s probably at the time. And he was never a really fit guy, but he decided he was going to start running. So he did, some 5Ks and 10Ks, and then he committed to doing a marathon. And we did the marathon. He's like, I'm going to do a marathon in every state. And over his lifetime, he did that. And he ultimately did a marathon in every country, including Antarctica. He went down there and ran a whole marathon on a treadmill in some kind of whatever you do to get to Antarctica. But let's say he had some resources most people don't, but he still did the work, and he didn't do it until way later in life.
Yeah.
Well, hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and insight. You're so connected to some of this. It's great to see somebody on the inside that is caring about wellness, did see what happened during COVID and wants to help us not do that again. So anything we can do to keep the grassroots behind you, to keep pushing the wellness agenda, to get food that does let you lose 4 pounds eating it, that would be fantastic to have here in the United States. So again, thank you so much, Warren.
Yeah, thanks, George. Thank you both.
Thank you.